Just an important note before we dive in. This episode was recorded before PCOS was renamed PMOS, Polyendocrine Metabolic Ovarian Syndrome. Throughout this episode and some original episode materials, you may hear or see the former name PCOS used.
PCOS, it is one of the most common hormonal issues in women of reproductive age. So the statistic right now is 1 in 8 women globally are dealing with this disorder. And despite how common it is, it still remains one of the most consistently mishandled conditions in women's health. At its core, PCOS is driven by elevated androgens. These excess androgens can disrupt ovulation, and when ovulation is disrupted, you get further cascade of issues beyond just the excess androgens. This is affecting your energy, your metabolism, your skin, your mood, your fertility. It affects everything. I've spent years helping women understand their hormones, and one of the most powerful shifts I've seen is what happens when you start working with your cycle instead of against it. It's not just about fewer symptoms, it's about feeling more like yourself again, more steady, more energized, more at home in your body. We studied cycle syncing, and 92% of women had less PMS in just 60 days. If you're curious, you can try it for free. Just download the MyFlow app on iTunes or Google Play and use the code FREEMONTH. Welcome to the Ovary Club. I'm your host, Alisa Vitti. Today's episode is a little different from what I normally do. Yes, we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about science and research and actionable things that are going to help you. But today I want to do something a little special, which is share my personal story of hormonal struggles and hormonal healing with you. Because I think that there are women listening right now who might be exactly where I was at 16, at 19, and you may be a different age, but going through a hormonal crisis of your own. And I just really want to share yes, we'll talk about the science of what it means and how to fix it, but just the emotional side of what it feels like to live through this journey, because we're not just a collection of symptoms. Obviously, we're women who are living this experience, and it can be really challenging. And I want you to know that I've been there too. I'm not just speaking to you as a women's hormone expert. I'm speaking to you as somebody who lives the practices that I talk about because it is necessary for me to stay healthy. So just a quick high level, I was told at 22 that I would likely never be able to have children due to a PCOS diagnosis. I'm now 48. I have 2 daughters, one that I had at 37, another one I had at 44. And I've managed this PCOS experience of mine naturally for the past 25 years pretty successfully. And this is not a story that I'm sharing to impress you or to make you feel like you're not doing enough. I'm sharing it because I want you to know that if PCOS is something that you're going through, or any hormonal situation that you're dealing with, you're 100% capable of creating transformation in your body. That is possible. And we're going to do that by addressing the root cause, not by chasing symptoms, because you've likely already tried that, and I know that it is not working. Today, we're going to cover my full PCOS story, including the parts I don't really get a chance to talk a lot about in public. We're going to talk about what PCOS actually is, what's driving it, what triggers it, what treatments don't really help, and then, of course, the exact protocol that I've used on myself, but also with my clients at Flow Living. And this is one of the longest protocols in existence that is natural for PCOS. This is going to be a juicy deep dive. So get comfortable, make yourself a cup of tea, get a notepad, and know that everything I'm about to share, I'm sharing because I genuinely believe that it can help you. And if you're not yet following the Ovary Club on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify, please do. And if someone in your life is struggling with PCOS, please share this episode with them. The whole point of this podcast is so that we can share information as women about what information we need to make critical health decisions about our hormones. And this is a conversation I wish I could have had with someone when I was going through my PCOS journey as a teen. So let's dive in. I want to start at the beginning with the story of a girl who had no idea what was going on with her body, and had no language, no community, no roadmap for what she was experiencing. You have to remember that when I was a teen, there was no social media, there was no internet. It was back in the day. And so there was just no at all perspective that something like this could be happening. And I think it's so wonderful now that this is much more common knowledge. I didn't get my first period until 2 months before my 16th birthday. And remember, I was the president of the period club starting in 6th grade. And so I was really last in my group to get my period. And everybody else was getting that at 12 and 13. And I just it wasn't happening. Not only that, that might just sound like a number like, okay, I didn't get my period till I was 16. But what that felt like beyond seeing all my friends, getting their periods, which we were all so excited about, but it was really also that I wasn't developing the same way that everybody else was. I could see that I wasn't going through puberty. I didn't look like a woman in the making. I kind of just was this sort of chunky, I was sort of stuck in my body. It's really hard to describe, but I remember talking to my dad. We were hanging out on the fence watching my younger brother at Little League practice. And I said, Dad, I think something's wrong with me because I don't look like the other girls in my class. And that was the best way that I could express what I was feeling. Again, because there was no reference points for any of this as I was going through it. And of course, my dad being the awesome feminist dad that he has always been, he's like, what you look like doesn't matter, and don't worry about that. And it was a lovely sentiment, but there was nowhere for me to kind of try to understand why wasn't I going through puberty, fundamentally. And I was gaining weight at this rate that did not make any sense based on what I was eating. I mean, I grew up in a pretty healthy household, but the weight just kept expanding as I went through the teen years. My acne was outrageously bad. I mean, the amount of emotional suffering that came out of that acne is hard to put into words, but it got to a point where I was so heavy on my feet and the acne was so profound that I would have to sit down and spackle on very thick under eye concealer. I used to use Prescriptive's under eye concealer as a foundation because most foundation would not cover the swelling, the redness, and it would take about 30 minutes to do all of that, as I called it, spackling. And I couldn't stand up that long because I was I was obese. And so my hair was crazy. There was facial hair popping out everywhere. I mean, it was really challenging. And it was also challenging to make it through the day. I was like brain foggy. It was very hard to wake up in the morning. I could not fall asleep at night. And I really felt like something was fundamentally wrong with me. And no one had any clue as to what was happening. It was really very frustrating. And between the ages of 12 and 22, right, when someone should be starting their menstruation journey, I got my period a total of 4, maybe 5 times. So what does that mean? I had my first bleed 2 months before my 16th birthday. Then I didn't have another one for almost a year. And at that point, because I was 16, it was finally time that I was able to go to the gynecologist. And so she said, well, it's been a year, so let's give you some synthetic progesterone because we want to sort of flush out any endometrial lining to prevent any problems from developing. So I did my first round of that, and that was the worst kind of period you could have, the worst PMS. I didn't react well to the synthetic hormones. And then I didn't get another. I got maybe another one naturally, maybe almost a year later. And then again, so now I'm almost 18, still no period, had to do another round of that. And so this is kind of once a year, I'd kind of be stimulated with a little synthetic progesterone to cleanse out the endometrium that might have been building here and there with all of these wonky hormones. And I was asking questions, guys, of that gynecologist, like, what's going on? Why isn't this happening? She's like, and literally this is what she would say with all the presentation of all these symptoms. She would say, this is normal. You're just in puberty and it's normal for your body not to know how to establish a regular cycle. And I said, well, that didn't even make any sense to me. And I was not a medical expert by any stretch of the imagination at that point. And I thought, it shouldn't be once a year. Maybe the first year you might be a little irregular, but not several years down the line, right? And so this conversation between myself and gynecologist continued for about 7 years. And like I said, by the time I was 19, I was at my peak weight. I was 210 pounds. I'm 5'6". That's a lot of weight. There's a photo of me on Instagram that I put up when I was at this peak weight. I was visiting the Grand Canyon. And, I just look at that photo of myself and, just, seeing all that inflammation, seeing all that hormonal struggle, I always send a lot of love to that version of myself because it was a very hard time. And again, something was clearly very wrong. This was, unfortunately, however, the 90s. There was no internet. There was no functional medicine as we know it today. And there wasn't really even a Whole Foods in most cities. There was no framework for understanding what PCOS was or how to address it. So, of course, since we didn't know what was going on, the process was, well, let's try to deal with some of these symptoms. So, my mom took me to see this wonderful facial person who turned me on to some natural skincare. I remember she gave me facials with the Dr. Hauschka line. Unfortunately, none of it really worked for my skin, but it kind of got me interested in natural modalities, which I still am a huge fan of today. But, the acne was not topical. Nonetheless, we then went to a conventional dermatologist. She put me on all sorts of topical things that didn't work. And then eventually she started putting me on rounds of antibiotics, which did help clear the skin. But then, of course, would destroy my gut, give me all sorts of yeast infections. And it was just, and it was starting to tank my immune response as well. I was starting to get chronic colds, of course, because you're destroying that gut microbiome and my immunity. So it was not good, but we were trying anything to help deal with my symptoms. The weight, the acne, the hair loss was starting then, the missing periods, the anxiety, the depression. It was really frustrating. And the story that I tell is that, finally when I was at Johns Hopkins, I was able to have access to information. And so, of course, what does a girl with all of these issues do on a Friday or Saturday night? Well, it's not like I was in the mood to party all the time. So I would end up in the medical library and I would just scour medical journals, obstetrics journals, gynecology journals to try to figure out what could be wrong with me. And it was in one obstetrics journal that there was a tiny little sliver of on the furthest right-hand column of this page. I'll never forget. And it said, Stein-Leventhal disease. And I said, okay, what's that? And I was reading it and they just started talking about the presentation of symptoms. And that was one of those transformational moments because on that page, I saw the picture of myself, my symptoms, my experience, and every single bell rang. I was like, oh, this must be what I have. So I grabbed that journal and the next day, stalked my gynecologist without an appointment outside in the parking lot before she, even had the office open. And, because I'd been seeing her pretty regularly trying to deal with this situation. And I said, I think I have a lead on what it is that I have. I'm certain that this is what I have. And so I went in giving her the instruction of what to test, how to do some testing based on my research. And she was very amenable. She did the testing that day. And then when I was called back to review the results with her, that's when I finally, 7 years after my very first period, got the diagnosis for PCOS. And, that 7-year number, that hasn't changed very much for a lot of women with different conditions. 7 years is still the average diagnosis time for PCOS, for endometriosis, for fibroids. And that was 25 years ago. I'd really love it if in the future the diagnosis time was, 6 months. We should be able to know what's going on with us as women when we're looking for care. But back to that moment, it was so exciting to get that confirmation when I walked back into her office after the results came in. She's like, "You're right. You have this disorder. This is what you have." And I said, "Great." I was like in that moment, I was actually relieved and elated because not knowing is it's hard to take action when you don't know what's going on. It's hard to figure out, well, what should I prioritize because you're not even sure what's happening. So having an anchor around what the diagnosis was felt like a turning point. And then the next turning point happened immediately in the same moment where she said, because I asked her, "Now what?" I'm a New Englander. I'm like very practical. I'm like, "Okay, so what do we do? Great. I'm glad we know what it is. What do we do?" And she said, "Well, that's just the thing. We don't know what's causing this. We don't have a cure. We don't really even have any truly effective treatment. What we have are some tools that we can leverage that are not intended for this disorder, but could potentially, possibly, hopefully help you mitigate some of these symptoms." Because she then gave me sort of this prognosis after the diagnosis. She's like, "Okay, so you have the PCOS. The prognosis is obesity, diabetes, infertility, heart disease, cancer, dementia, like in progression as you age. And there's nothing we can do. And we can just try to medicate you along the way. Like, let's put you on birth control immediately to give you a cycle," which that was sort of the first flag. And then she said, "And then, maybe when you want to have children, because it's very unlikely that you'll be able to do that naturally, then we can kind of think about, artificial reproductive technologies. And then as your obesity starts to become, impactful metabolically and cardiovascularly, we can, put you on medications for those types of things." And here I am, I don't remember my age, 20, 19, 20. And I'm thinking to myself, I thought to myself, this sounds terrible, first of all. And then my body just in that moment very clearly spoke to me and said, "That's not your future." And so she's like, "So do you want me to write you a prescription for birth control?" And I just repeated what I heard. I said, "That's not my future." And she's like, "What are you talking about?" And I said, "I'm not sure yet, but I'm pretty clear that it doesn't make sense for me to take a medication that suppresses ovulation when I'm already not ovulating. So I can't find the logic in that to agree to that treatment plan." And she said, "I hear you. I understand that concern." And she was very wonderful to be able to have those types of dialogue with. She was very open and interested in my thinking process because it was a new experience for her as well. This was not something that she was treating on a regular basis. And so she said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to continue doing what I have been doing, which is the research that I was doing that brought me here to you today with this diagnosis, right? And I'm going to see what I can do." And I just happened to be so fortunate that I was at Johns Hopkins as a student and was privy to some of the things that were coming out of the Human Genome Project at that time, which was looking at, and this is all very technical stuff, and I won't spend too much time here, but they were looking at identical twins, and they were looking at asking a very important question. Why would identical twins, from a DNA perspective, genetic material perspective, why would one develop a disease and the other one wouldn't? And what they discovered in the Human Genome Project was this other structure called the epigenome. And it's like a series of proteins that wrap around your DNA, and they switch genetic material on and off. And what they were looking at was what drives that process of switching these genes on and off. And they found that there were only two things that drove that process, which then was that sort of next turning point for me. So what am I going to do about this? Those two things were diet and lifestyle. And I said, my goodness, if diet and lifestyle was powerful enough to alter an identical twin's genetic expression into a disease state or not, then my thesis is that, and again, this is almost 30 years ago now, my thesis before functional medicine was diet and lifestyle levers must be the key to helping my endocrine system, which is totally dysregulated, get to be back into homeostasis, back into functioning the way that it should. And that's the basis of the flow protocol, the basis of my work, and what I've been, sort of championing for many, many decades now. And what I want to share with you today is how do we get out of hormonal chaos, because that's the lowest lows of my story. But the things that happen once I figured this out, once I figured out how to interact with my endocrine system and give it the right inputs. I mean, I've maintained about a 70-pound weight loss for 30 years. That's very challenging to do by most, investigations, right? I've had my 2 children at advanced maternal ages, right? And I've been cycling regularly and ovulating monthly since the age of 22. My skin also cleared up. I mean, I didn't do anything. I didn't take anything. I didn't do anything to my skin. Once my hormones started working the way that they should be, and my endocrine system was functioning optimally, the body restored. All those symptoms just went away. And was just the most exciting thing that had happened to me. And I wanted to do everything in my power to bring that knowledge and that training and that information to other women. Because when I was in that chair in the doctor's office, I realized, not only that I had this diagnosis, but also that, my goodness, I must be one of millions of other women who are dealing with these types of gynecological issues, whether it be PCOS or later on, I would understand fibroids, endometriosis, ovarian cysts, et cetera. All these things that modern medicine doesn't really know what to do with, aside from putting us on birth control, which suppresses hormones, which isn't really a fix. And I remember thinking to myself, if I could do something to feel better, I really would love to help other women, because that was always my plan anyway, right? So here we are. I'm going to give you the goods, but I just wanted to tell you that I fully understand what it feels like when you are in the midst of it. And you may have PCOS, you may be dealing with infertility struggles, you may be dealing with fibroids, you might be dealing with perimenopause symptoms, and you don't feel like yourself. I know what that feels like to not feel like yourself. And I want you to know that I see you. We can work on this. You're here learning the things that you need to learn to help yourself. And as long as you're willing to understand your biology and support it, then the inevitable outcome of that is that your hormones will start to be more balanced and function the way that they should. Period. All the puns intended, of course. Okay, so let's start with what PCOS actually is, because most women are just handed a diagnosis without like a deeper explanation, and you can't really work on something if you don't understand. Like you'd never put a piece of furniture together if you didn't understand all the moving parts, right? And so we need a roadmap of what it is. So PCOS is an acronym, and it stands for Polycystic Ovarian Syndrome. There is some, discussion all the time about, should we call it a syndrome? Should we call it a disease? PCOD. I think at this point, adding in new terminology might only serve to create more confusion, but if there's a compelling enough reason to rename it, I'm here for that. But right now, I think this is something that we can all just say, this is what the acronym stands for, PCOS. It is one of the most common hormonal issues in women of reproductive age. So the statistic right now is 1 in 8 women globally are dealing with this disorder. And despite how common it is, it still remains one of the most consistently mishandled conditions in women's health, which, if you've been through the diagnosis process, it probably doesn't surprise you. At its core, PCOS is driven by elevated androgens. You've probably referred to these as male hormones, but everybody makes those in their body, women too. It's when those levels become elevated, when our body doesn't handle them properly, that problems start. There's deeper reasons why that happens. That happens on the level of the ovarian mitochondria. But back to the androgens, these excess androgens, they really can disrupt ovulation. And when ovulation is disrupted, you get further cascade of issues beyond just the excess androgens. And so this is affecting your energy, your metabolism, your skin, your mood, your fertility. It affects everything because the ovary obviously, and its hormonal output affects every single system of your body. If you've ever wanted to ask me your own hormone questions, the Ovary Club Insiders is where you can do that. You'll get access to private podcast episodes where I answer real member questions with clear, science-backed guidance you can actually use. Join us at alisaviti.com/insiders. So here's where I want to slow down, because I think this is the part of the conversation where things can get a little confusing for women. So there is a conversation that talks about how there are different types of PCOS, and the type that you have kind of should speak to some of the ways that you should prioritize your self-care plan. And I think that that's really helpful. It's not a small distinction, so we want to get everything accurate. At the same time, there are some universal things that happen with the endocrine system. So if you aren't sure about which type you have, it's okay. But here are some reference points that might resonate with you. So the most common that the vast majority of women with PCOS have is the insulin-resistant driven PCOS. This is the most common because it speaks to this mitochondrial dysfunction that exists from a genetic perspective already inside the ovarian ecosystem that drives some of this hyperandrogen production, and that is creating a problem with insulin resistance. And so, the idea here is if you know that you have this insulin-driven type of PCOS, that you would want to focus on blood sugar stability. I would argue that that's true regardless, but let's just keep looking at some of these other classifications to see if you think that there's something there for you. The other type of PCOS that I've heard referenced is this sort of inflammation-based PCOS. So this one can go a little bit undiagnosed for longer because you may not present the classic picture of PCOS. You may have clear skin, your weight's fine, but you're not ovulating, you're not menstruating. And so the inflammation that's driving this type of disrupted ovulation is let's call it the terrain. So you are overloaded with endocrine disruptive chemicals. You might have some gut dysregulation that's driving, impacting the ovarian function negatively. So there's that. Then there is this adrenal PCOS that where the adrenal glands are overstimulated by androgens, and it's difficult for you to that elevated cortisol starts to disrupt your ovarian function. And so stress management might be like a higher priority for you. As you'll see, I feel like this is just like slicing the onion in different ways, but fundamentally, when we look at it from the level of the endocrine system, you've got to deal with your blood sugar, you've got to deal with your terrain, you've got to deal with your stress. It really, it's okay to know that maybe you have a different type, but fundamentally we all have to kind of do similar work. And then there's this, what is referred to as synthetic hormone-induced PCOS, so meaning you've been on birth control for a long time, and the brain-ovary communication just is not restarting after you get off of it. And so rebuilding that pathway of the hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis is something that you want to focus on. Now, most women are automatically treated for, and this is why I wanted to bring up these different diagnoses or these different nuanced ways that PCOS could evolve, is because most women, when they go to their doctor, they're treated as if they have the insulin-resistant type of PCOS. So I think it's worth being able to understand that that might not always be true. And if you are in a conversation with your doctor, to get some specific testing, right? To look at, what is your CRP level, to kind of see if you have that inflammation situation. You could do a gut microbiome test. You could order those directly at home, right? You don't have to do that with your doctor. You should look at your fasting glucose levels and your A1C levels to see if it's insulin resistance, right? That is driving your PCOS. So you can kind of start to push and involve yourself in the diagnostic process with your physician, so that you can really start to get the best care plan from the medical side of things for you as possible, right? So you may not need metformin, for example, if you're not dealing with that insulin resistance. So it's good to know that there are different things that are causing it and that you may have some special vulnerabilities, right? If you have some challenges with methylation that drive up your inflammation, for example, those are good things for you to know about. So if you've been diagnosed with PCOS, I recommend asking for a full hormone panel that includes that fasting insulin, blood glucose, DHEAS, and circulating androgens. This way, you're going to really understand what potential flavor of PCOS you have and helps you kind of focus on those special vulnerabilities that you have that are unique to you. Okay, what are the symptoms of this if you're listening and you feel like something is off, you don't yet have a diagnosis, but you've been told everything looks normal? It's like the worst thing to hear. Like everything, your labs are normal. And then meanwhile, you're sitting there like, I feel terrible. How could that be? I know that's frustrating. I hear that all the time. But since you're here listening, it tells me that you're getting some biofeedback from your body that it's sending you signals that you can no longer ignore. So let's talk about what the symptoms might be if you don't yet know that you have it, but you're suspicious. Because on average, women see multiple providers before they ever get this diagnosis. And so I want you to understand what these could look like. And part of the challenge is that not only are you seeing multiple practitioners or providers, but also the symptoms can be so wide-ranging, again, because the ovary affects every single system of the body. It can be really challenging to get to this diagnosis clearly. And because when we are only looking at this insulin-resistant classic PCOS, if you will, profile, practitioners might miss it because if you don't present with that exact set of symptoms like I did, then it could be harder to get to that diagnosis. So the one symptom that shows up with every single PCOS woman is irregular and missing periods, right? So and when I say and, what I mean is, you can, depending on how you want to define that, you could say an irregular period is like 35 days or in some cases every 6 months, right? So it's just semantics, but it's this highly irregular, unpredictable set of menstruation, experience of menstruation. And whether that feels like you're missing or skipping periods or they're just irregular, it's just the language that you want to use. But that is true for women with PCOS because every single type of PCOS disrupts ovulation in some way. And that's the issue. When ovulation isn't happening consistently, your cycle will pay the price and you're not going to have one, right? And so for some women, like I said, the period kind of shows up whenever it feels like. For other women, it's like me, it was like months and months and months of stretches between. And that's really the unifying symptom. Beyond that, there are a wide range depending on your type of PCOS and your individual biology. So other common symptoms, but not necessarily universally true, are unexplained weight gain, especially around the midsection. And I would also say that there's like a particular look in the face. It's not that your face is chubbier, it's like an inflammation kind of look, having lived through that myself. So, I would say there's a puffiness of weight, not just unexplained weight gain. And then difficulty losing weight. It's like a real challenge to actually have your body function metabolically properly. And I know that very well. I have to do more than the average bear to, keep myself at a healthy weight. And, certainly have had inner dialogue that I know a lot of you have had, which is, gee, it seems like it's so much easier for other people. And for other people who do not have this sort of PCOS, makeup internally that affects so many systems of the body, it can be a little easier. I'm not going to lie about that. But that doesn't mean that you can't work around it and work it to your benefit. Okay, so there's the weight. Another symptom is the acne, especially along the jawline, the chest, the back of the arms, the back, like places where, your girlfriends are not necessarily getting a lot of acne, a lot of action, right, in terms of skin activity. Unwanted hair growth, I luckily didn't have as much as my mom did. And I think my mom had undiagnosed PCOS and thyroid issues for her whole life. But I definitely would get lots of, growth here, like there and it's cyclical too. I would notice at different times of the cycle, like I would sprout my different, chin, jawline hairs, right? Um, and also on the chest, more hair that, is more typical of seeing on a male physique than on a female, right? So little hairs on your chest, around your areola, those types of things. Hair thinning on the scalp and lots of shedding. I mean, the amount of hair that I used to shed was scary enough for my mom to talk about it with anybody who would listen to her. She's like, I don't understand how this girl is losing that much hair. Part of the journey. Mood changes, so much mood destabilization, at least that I experienced, but that is definitely something that can happen to you. And why? Because when your cells are not able to get the glucose that they need, that means your brain will suffer, your mood will suffer as a result of that. It's harder to concentrate. I mean, when I work with women of every age, at every type of hormonal issue, and especially working with women with sort of the end of perimenopause, the beginning of menopause, there's a lot of similarity with that experience and PCOS. So it's not in your head. You're not imagining it. It is affecting your mood. And to me, when I started actually recovering from this issue, it was like night and day, being able to concentrate and be happy. And it wasn't doing anything special for that to happen, right? It just, when my hormones were balanced, that started happening for me. Low energy and fatigue. That is it's not necessarily chronic fatigue. It's just, again, part of this metabolic disorder, and I want you to be thinking more about it as a metabolic disorder that is driving the ovarian dysregulation. And then, of course, difficulty with fertility, right? If you're not ovulating and you're not making enough progesterone, it's obviously going to be much more challenging to go through that fertility journey as one would want. And there can be other symptoms as well, but I want to make something clear. These are not random inconveniences. Like, it's not like, oh, your skin's a little extra bad and, oh, you're a little more moody than other people. These are signals. This is like multiple cries for help. When this is all happening, your body is really struggling. It's not normal for your body to have all of these symptoms. This is not something that you should just learn to live with. Your body is telling you that something is off in a multitude of your body's systems. And the goal is not to just try to silence them, which is sort of the idea of like spot treating your symptoms, like a cream for your skin or caffeine for your energy, or like, this is like these Band-Aid approach ways of just triaging symptoms on a day-to-day basis. Right. It's the same kind of thing. I don't like having people take, pain medication for cramps, because let's get to, why are you having those cramps in the first place? Why are all the systems of your body signaling to you that something is off with your PCOS? What are we missing? And when we get to that root cause and we start treating that root cause, then in my experience now, personally and professionally over the past 30 years, that's when the body starts to recover its homeostasis. Homeostasis means bringing itself back into its own equilibrium, its own balance, right? And that's the whole premise of everything that I want you to understand about dealing with your PCOS. We're going to get to the protocol in a second, but I just want to, in case you haven't yet had diagnosis, how is it actually diagnosed? There are 3 criteria that your doctor should be looking at. Elevated androgens is critical. Irregular or absent ovulation. And then, again, potentially, not in every case, the existence of polycystic follicles of ovaries on an ultrasound. And PCOS diagnosis is typically confirmed when there's at least 2 of these things present. Couple things. having multiple follicles on your ovaries can be completely normal, especially in younger women. So a scan that shows multiple follicles doesn't necessarily indicate PCOS. So again, you have to have, and on the flip side, a scan that's completely clear doesn't rule out PCOS either. So this is why it's a little tricky on the practitioner side to diagnose. This is why we need multiple touch points to confirm this diagnosis, and elevated androgens is a really powerful tool. I would also argue that chronically elevated A1C level, so showing that high degree of insulin resistance, could be another part of the picture. And the other thing is, if you've been told that everything looks normal in your labs, based on blood work, you should ask what's actually being tested, because standard lab ranges are broad. And I would encourage you to listen to the episode that I did with Dr. Carrie Jones about lab work and reference ranges, so that you can really dive deep and get educated about that. Your situation might mean that you need a more nuanced or a tighter evaluation of those lab ranges, and a full panel matters. So you deserve that full picture, and you want to make sure that you're asking for that. Let's go into what triggers PCOS and how does this even happen in the first place. Understanding what it looks like on the symptom level and how it feels is one thing, but knowing what's actually driving it is where we start to build momentum towards planning our self-care to recover, right?